You didn't wake up one morning and decide to stop caring what people thought of you. No, it wasn't that clean. It wasn't that chosen. You got pushed. Somewhere between all those small humiliations and all those careful performances, something in you finally snapped. And the funny thing about that snap, the genuinely funny thing, is that everyone around you heard it as a breakdown. What it actually was a beginning. They told you to calm down. They told you that you were being too much. They handed you a mirror and showed you something they called a flaw, and they said it with such concern, such sincere pity, that you almost believed them. Almost. Because underneath that performance of concern, what they were actually saying was, you make me uncomfortable. And uncomfortable people are inconvenient people. And inconvenient people are dangerous people. And inconvenient people are dangerous people. And here you are. The moment we're discussing, I want to be precise about this. Because precision matters more than comfort is not the moment you became mean. It's not the moment you became bitter or cold or difficult. It's the moment you stopped performing for an audience that was never going to applaud anyway. You stopped. And in that stillness, that terrifying, beautiful stillness, you became something that civilized people have no framework for. You became someone who could not be managed. I know a man, deeply dedicated man, never a moment wasted, who decided the only way to be truly effective was to never let anyone know the cost. Never let the weight show, just absorb it. All of it. Every hit, every loss, every weight that no one else would carry. He called that strength. I always thought it looked more like a man terrified of what he'd say if he ever stopped moving long enough to be asked. But we were talking about you and how dangerous you've become. Let me tell you exactly what happened to you. Because I think someone should. With accuracy and without all that soft light people tend to use when they'd rather make you feel better than show you something true. You started life with an instinct, a particular way of feeling the world that was several magnitudes louder than the people around you. You noticed things other people walked past. You felt things other people filed away under, not worth dwelling on. You held intensity the way other people hold breath, not as a choice, but as your natural state of being. And then the corrections began. They started small. A parent's frown. A parent's frown. A classroom's laughter that landed on you, instead of beside you. A friendship that evaporated the moment you needed too much, or said too much, or felt too much. You learned, because you were smart, because you were adaptable, because you desperately wanted to belong. You learned to sand the edges, to arrive at a room pre-edited, pre-managed, pre-packaged into something more digestible. And it worked. For a while. The world rewarded you for it. People called you mature. They called you easy to be around. They said you were finally settling down, finally growing up, finally becoming someone they could count on. You nodded. You smiled. You quietly congratulated yourself on the performance, and then went home and sat in silence with the version of you that never got to leave the house. Here is the internal monologue I imagine you have, and I mean this with complete sincerity, not mockery. You lie down at night and you think, something is wrong with me. You think, I want too much. You think, why can't I just be satisfied like everyone else seems to be? You run through the interactions of the day like someone reviewing footage for mistakes. There, that moment, I was too direct. There, that moment, I should have laughed instead of going quiet. There, I asked for too much, pushed too hard, cared too visibly. And the worst part, the part that genuinely interests me, is that you've gotten good at it. The self-surveillance. You've internalized the audience so completely that you no longer need them to be present to perform for them. You carry the critic inside. Now, carry them with you everywhere. Built them right into the architecture of your daily thought. And then something happened. Maybe it was a betrayal specific enough to name. Maybe it was a slow accumulation, years of shrinking, years of calibrating, years of arriving second in your own life. And one day you woke up, and the cost simply outweighed the reward. Maybe someone looked at you after all that careful performance and still found you insufficient. Maybe you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the face looking back because the face had been restructured so many times to suit different rooms that it had forgotten its own original shape. Whatever it was, the thing that had always been underneath, that loud, unedited, impossible to manage intensity, it stopped asking permission. And here is where people around you made their critical error. They called it falling apart. They called it a crisis. They gathered around with their resources and their frameworks and their carefully curated language about healing and processing and getting back to baseline. They wanted to put you back into the shape that fit inside the box they'd prepared for you. They didn't understand that what they were witnessing wasn't a collapse. It was a threshold. So let me ask you the question that all of this has been circling. The real question, stripped of every soft edge. What if the most dangerous thing about you isn't the thing you were told to fix? What if the version of you that terrified everyone, the one they called unstable, difficult, overwhelming, too much? What if that version wasn't the problem? What if it was always the answer? They called it a breakdown. They called it losing control. They wrapped it in clinical language, or disappointed sighs, or the particular silence of people who no longer know what to do with you. And what they were really doing, all of them, was mislabeling something they found inconvenient. A breakdown implies structural failure. A load-bearing wall collapsing. Something going wrong inside a machine that was working correctly before. But what if the machine was never built for you? What if the structure that broke was not yours? What if you were so busy holding up a shape, someone else's shape, someone else's idea of who you should be at every given moment, that when the shape finally gave way, what fell wasn't you. What fell was the performance. You didn't break. You refused. Those are not the same thing, and anyone who tells you otherwise has a vested interest in you staying manageable. The word they should have used is threshold, not breakdown, not crisis. Threshold, the place where what you were willing to endure ran out, and what you actually are stepped forward. That intensity, that loudness, that feeling of being several frequencies beyond what the room can absorb. Let's talk about where it actually comes from, because the story you were told about it is almost entirely wrong. You were told it was excess, that you had too much of something, too much feeling, too much need, too much hunger for things that reasonable people had learned to let go. And the implication, always underneath, was that this excess was a deficiency. That having more meant lacking something others possessed. Restraint, maturity, the graceful ability to not care quite so much. But intensity is not excess. It is depth, and depth is not a flaw in the instrument. It is the instrument's truest specification. The people who told you that you were too much were people who had learned, at great personal cost, to be less. They had sanded themselves down to fit the available space. And they called the process growing up. They called the result peace. But look closely, and I mean really look. The way I find so easy, and what you see is not peace. What you see is exhaustion wearing a very convincing mask. Your intensity was never the problem. What was never given to you was the right context to use it. People who judge intensity in others, who find it threatening or exhausting or somehow indecent, are almost exclusively people who have spent considerable energy suppressing the same thing in themselves. Their discomfort is not about you. It is a mirror. You show them something they decided, at some point in their past, was too dangerous to keep. You know, I once had the fascinating experience of watching someone construct a very elaborate system of rules. Rules about appropriate and inappropriate response. Rules about the right degree of feeling. Rules about how much one ought to let circumstances matter. And they applied these rules with such rigorous consistency that you might have thought they were actually at peace with them. They weren't, of course. They were afraid. Afraid that if they relaxed the rules for a single moment, something they'd locked down in themselves would surface, and they'd have to deal with it. And the dealing would cost them everything they'd built, so they judged instead. It's cheaper. Easier to point at the water in someone else's boat than to bail their own. The judgment directed at your intensity is an artifact of other people's fear. Take it for exactly what it is. Nothing more. Let's be useful for a moment. The same intensity that made you too much in the environments that rejected you is precisely what makes you extraordinary in any environment that deserves you. Here is a partial inventory of what that intensity produces when it is not apologizing for its own existence. You are not capable of shallow commitment. When you care about something, a person, a project, a truth, you pursue it with a totality that most people can only approximate. People describe this as obsession when they find it inconvenient, and as passion when they want something from it. Same quality, two interpretations, neither of them yours to manage. You read runes with accuracy that sometimes frightens you because you were trained to read them. Survival required it. You spent years calibrating yourself to other people's frequencies, and while that cost you, it also built in you a perceptual sensitivity that most people never develop. You notice what's actually happening, while others are still processing what's supposed to be happening. You have an extremely high threshold for actual difficulty. Not the difficulty of social performance, but real difficulty. The kind that requires sitting in discomfort without flinching, because you have been in discomfort your entire life, and you are still here. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the central competency of anyone who has ever done anything worth doing. The advantage was always there. It was just pointed in the wrong direction. Here is the difference, and I want you to hold this, because it is the difference between a knife used in panic and a knife held with intent. When your intensity is not owned, when you are still apologizing for it, still trying to dial it back, still half convinced they were right about it, it comes out sideways. As rage at the wrong moment, at the wrong person, as withdrawal so complete that even the right people can't reach you. As all or nothing decisions that feel like clarity at midnight and look like wreckage by morning. Unowned intensity is a fire in an unventilated room. It doesn't stop burning just because there's nowhere for it to go. It just starts consuming whatever's closest. Owned intensity is different. When you stop apologizing for it, when you look at it squarely and say, yes, this is mine. This is the shape of how I operate. It becomes directional. It becomes the thing that other people call charisma, or conviction, or the rare ability to make someone feel genuinely seen. It becomes the reason people remember conversations with you years later. It becomes the mechanism by which you build things that last, because you are constitutionally incapable of doing something halfway. The trait was never the problem. The problem was always the absence of permission. Now, here is where we become practical. Not in the way that people who sell you bright-colored journals are practical. In the way that actually changes the internal structure of how you think. The first thing you do, and this is immediate, not eventually, is you change the words you use on yourself. You stop using the word too. Too much, too intense, too direct, too sensitive. Too is a comparative judgment that presupposes a standard you didn't set and don't belong to. When you say I'm too much, what you are actually doing is agreeing with the verdict of a court you never consented to appear before. Replace it. Not with affirmations. I have no patience for affirmations. They are optimism wearing a paper crown. Replace it with accurate language. Not I'm too intense, but rather, I operate at a frequency this particular room wasn't built for. Not I'm too sensitive, but rather, I perceive at a resolution most people don't have access to. Not I'm falling apart, but rather, I've reached the limit of what I'll pretend is acceptable. Accuracy, not warmth. Accuracy is the kindest tea you can offer yourself. Because accuracy doesn't ask you to perform a feeling. It just requires you to see what's actually there. Some runes were designed, whether consciously or by accumulated habit, to keep you small, not out of malice, necessarily. Often simply because small was the shape that fit the available space, and no one ever stopped to ask whether the space itself was the problem. You need to take an honest inventory, not a dramatic burning of bridges inventory. That is theater, and theater is still performing. Just an honest one. Which relationships require you to pre-edit yourself before entering? Which rooms do you consistently leave feeling diminished? Not from anything said directly, but from the cumulative pressure of having to be a smaller version of yourself for the duration. Catalog them. Not to destroy them immediately, though some will go, and that is fine, and the grief of that is real and allowed. But to see them clearly. To stop being surprised by the shrinking that happens inside them. Once you've named the mechanism, it loses some of its power. Not all, but some. And some is the beginning of everything. The next time someone judges your intensity, in a meeting, in a relationship, in any arena where you exist, and make that existence known, you have two sentences. Internal. You don't say them out loud necessarily. You say them to yourself, in the exact moment the judgment lands. First sentence. I see what you're afraid of. Second sentence. It is not mine to manage. That is all. Not righteousness. Righteousness is just judgment wearing better shoes. Not rage. Not cold withdrawal. Just those two sentences, delivered to yourself with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought about this more than the person currently making it uncomfortable. Practice them. Make them automatic. They are not armor. Armor is still defensive. Still organized around the attack. They are posture. The posture of someone who is not waiting for permission. Here is the final internal posture. The one that, when it settles, changes everything else around it. You stop waiting for the verdict to come back differently. You have been, for a long time, operating as though there is some future moment where the right combination of people will finally look at you and say, yes, this, exactly as you are, we approve. We've looked it over, and we think it works. You've been performing, at some level, for that verdict. Holding some piece of yourself in reserve, not quite committed to existing in your full capacity, because full capacity hasn't been ratified yet. The ownership statement is this. The verdict is in, and I issued it, not loudly, not as a declaration to anyone else, not as proof of anything, just as a private, immovable fact. The way a door is closed, not as a statement of hostility, but simply because it has been closed, and the room beyond it is now its own. You stop needing the approval, not because you've suppressed the need. Suppressed things always find their way back, but because you've found something sturdier than approval to stand on. You've found your own assessment, and you trust it. That trust is what the world is going to call confidence, and find quietly terrifying, and find itself unable to look away from. Here is what is actually true. The system was never designed for you. The templates that get distributed at birth, the milestones, the acceptable trajectories, the carefully agreed upon definitions of success and sanity, and appropriate feeling, they were designed by committee, for the median. They were designed by committee, for the median, to produce a civilization that functions by keeping most of its components just uncomfortable enough to keep working, but not so uncomfortable that they stop. You were never the median. You were never the fit, intended recipient of those templates. And the thing about minds like yours, and I mean this with the closest thing I have to sincerity, is that they have always paid the highest price for a civilization that in return gives them the least accommodation. You were never asked whether the framework worked. You were handed it and told to fit. And when you couldn't, when the shape of you refused to compress into the available space, you were told that was the problem. The shape was the problem. You were the problem. But look around. Everything worth looking at was built by someone whose intensity everyone else found excessive. Every piece of music that has ever made you feel less alone was written by someone who felt more than the room could hold. Every system that ever changed anything was broken by someone who couldn't make peace with it the way it was. The people who built the walls are not remembered. The people who refused them are. What you have been told was your weakness, that insatiable, restless, impossible to manage depth of feeling, is the exact mechanism by which anything real gets made and anything dishonest gets exposed, and anyone sufficiently committed gets free. You didn't become dangerous when you started succeeding by the existing measures. You became dangerous the moment you stopped believing the measures applied. That's the moment right there. The moment you became dangerous was the moment you realized that the most honest response to a room full of people performing certainty was to simply stop performing it back. Not with anger, not with any announcement. Just the quiet, cold, perfectly calibrated decision to be exactly what you are and let the room adjust. It always adjusts. Or it doesn't, and you find a different room. Either way, you are no longer waiting. And people who are no longer waiting are the most dangerous kind of people. Here are, not because they'll hurt anyone, but because they cannot be managed. They cannot be motivated by fear of exclusion, because they've already survived it. They cannot be controlled by the threat of disapproval, because disapproval has been running at full capacity for years, and somehow, they're still standing. Still here, still entire. The ones who couldn't break you made you this. Thank them on your way out.